That Saturday afternoon, Denise Pflum was driving along a familiar county road in Indiana, already nightmare fueled. She was 18 years old, a high school senior with plans for the future, and she was on her way to do something completely ordinary. She left her purse at a party the night before and was simply going back to get it. There was nothing unusual about the drive and no obvious reason to believe that anything was about to change. But Denise would not make it home that day. Her disappearance soon became a mystery that would stretch across decades, leaving investigators with questions that became harder to answer as more time passed. Then suddenly, years later, a man would come forward with information about Denise, bringing investigators back to the case and raising the possibility that they might finally understand what had happened to her. But what followed would only make the mystery more complicated. But before this, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand how Denise Pflum's case became one of the most maddening cold cases in Indiana history, you have to understand who she was before any of this happened. Denise Diane Pflum lived in Connersville, a small manufacturing town in Fayette County, Indiana, tucked in the southeastern part of the state. According to her mother, Judy, who spoke about her daughter years later, Denise was not a struggling teenager or a girl with a troubled home life. She was a star athlete, she was a gifted artist, and she ranked at the top of her senior class, as well as she had already been accepted into Miami University in Ohio. And that is where she intended to study microbiology, which on a side note is the most Chad of any of the sciences. Her mother would later say that if Denise had lived, she believed her daughter would have ended up working on a cure for cancer, or perhaps decades later, a cure for the virus the world hadn't even encountered yet. This was a girl with direction, and this was a girl with a plan. For 3 years, Denise had been in a relationship with a young man named Sean McClung. It was a long relationship by high school standards, the kind that becomes part of someone's identity in a small town where everyone knows everyone, likely to become one of those like marrying your high school sweetheart sort of things. But weeks before the events of this story, Denise ended things with Sean, and according to her mother, after the breakup, Denise began socializing more. She was spending more time with friends, she was dating again, tentatively stepping into a version of her senior year that didn't revolve around one relationship. But something about the breakup unsettled her. In the weeks before she disappeared, Denise wrote a letter. In it, she expressed genuine fear connected to the end of her relationship with Sean. We don't know every word of that letter, but we know its emotional core, and it's a detail that investigators would return to again and again in the years that followed, because it suggested that whatever ended between them, it did not end quietly in Denise's mind. On March 27, 1986, which was Good Friday that year, Denise went to a spring break bonfire party. It was a big gathering by small-town standards, with roughly 100 people attending, held out on a rural farm property near Glenwood, Indiana, land that belonged to the Johnson family. Bonfire parties like this were a normal ritual for teenagers in that part of the country, a chance to gather in a field, build a fire, probably wake up in that field and let the last stretch of high school feel infinite for one night. At some point during or after the party, Denise left her purse behind. It's such a small human detail, it's almost not even worth mentioning, but anyone who has ever misplaced a bag at a party, a bar, or a friend's house, usually a wallet by men's standards, understands the mild annoyance of realizing that, well, you left something, and now you gotta go make a mental note about it and then go back and grab it. For Denise, that middle note would turn into the most consequential decision of her life. The next day, March 28, 1986, a Saturday, Denise left her family home in Connersville around 12:30 in the afternoon. She got into her Buick Regal alone and drove back out towards the party site to retrieve her purse. There was nothing unusual about this. It was daylight. It was a short trip. She had made the same drive countless times before to countless other places. But this time, she would never come back. Some accounts mention that a friend reportedly saw Denise at around 2 p.m. at a fashion bug store in Connersville, which would place her back in the town several hours after she had left to retrieve her purse. However, this sighting has never been clearly established, and it does not fit neatly with the reported timeline of Denise leaving around 12:30 p.m. So while that sighting is part of the case, it remains quite uncertain. What is clear is that Denise never returned home that evening, and when her family realized she was missing, they reported her disappearance immediately. The following day, a local farmer discovered her car. It was found locked and abandoned along Tower Road, a rural stretch roughly 3 miles from where the bonfire had taken place. There were no signs of a struggle in or around the vehicle, no broken glass, no blood, no indication of any violence at that scene. This detail raises the strangest and most important facts around this entire case. The car was locked. If Denise had been forcibly abducted from her vehicle, why would it end up locked afterwards? Kind of a strange detail. Either she got out and locked it herself before something happened to her nearby, which would suggest she may have known whoever she encountered next, or someone else took her, drove the car to that location, and deliberately locked it behind them to slow down the discovery. Both possibilities point towards something other than a random roadside abduction by a stranger. Both possibilities point towards intention. And with the car sitting abandoned on Tower Road, the mystery of what happened to Denise Pflum officially began. Nobody in Fayette County could have known it would take 34 years to get even a partial answer. And this is where the investigation took its first major turn. Instead of treating Denise's disappearance as an urgent case, police initially considered the possibility that maybe she had just run away. That conclusion was made despite her strong academic record, her college acceptance, her lack of any known history of running away, and the fact that her car had been found abandoned and locked miles away from where it expected to be. So, I always like to quote Wendigo on this one. The police delayed searching the skeleton pile for as long as possible, and then when they did, they found skeletons. It's like, the more of these I cover, the more this just seems to be the case. Like, there's kind of a general, like, they'll come back. They're kind of like not giving a shit, and it's kind of wild to me. But anyways, so think about how much time that assumption had actually cost the search. Every hour spent treating a possible homicide as a bored teenager blowing off steam in an hour where evidence degrades, memories fade, and the perpetrator gets to settle back into normal life undisturbed, or even just run away, all happens. The detective assigned to lead the investigation was a man named Ted McQuinley. One important detail is that McQuinley was Denise's father's cousin. The lead investigator on a missing person case involving a possible homicide was a blood relative of the victim's family. In any properly run, modern investigation, this alone would trigger a conflict of interest recusal. In 1986, in a small county sheriff's department, it apparently didn't raise a single flag. And also, very strange that he's related, and was also just kind of like, oh, yeah, well, we'll hang out for a little bit. Anyways, what McQuinley did with the case afterward is almost impossible to believe by today's investigative standards. He took 0 written notes throughout the entire investigation. Not sparse notes or, well, let me, put this on a napkin. Not incomplete notes. None. He relied entirely on memory like a complete idiot. He is also documented as having consulted psychics as part of his investigative process, treating supernatural guesswork as an acceptable substitute for forensic procedure. This is, without a doubt, one of the most incompetent investigators It's not funny what happened, but it boggles the mind. Anyways, he never searched Denise's bedroom, a missing 18-year-old girl's most private space, the place most likely to contain letters, diaries, or clues about her state of mind and her relationships. That was just never examined. He never pulled her phone records either, meaning investigators had no way of knowing who Denise had been talking to in the days or weeks leading up to her disappearance. Because remember, there were cell phones around this time. 1986, they were bricks, but there were cell phones. So no way, they had no way to trace a pattern of calls, even home phones who may have pointed towards a threat or argument or a plan, nothing. So these early decisions had lasting effects on the case. Of course, pulling records like that was a little more difficult back in the day. Really, you're not going to be pulling any cell phone records because, they were very, very rare. And honestly, I'm not even sure if you could pull cell phone records back then, but you could pull landline records. Now you can't because all of them are destroyed. They were pretty much just paper back then, but you could still do it, technically speaking. And in a potential homicide case, you probably should pull phone records, is all I'm saying. And if you think being enraged by this stupidity is, over, it's not. So with important evidence left unexamined and key questions unanswered, later investigators had fewer reliable leads to work with. The case remained unsolved for more than 3 decades, until renewed attention eventually brought some of those unanswered questions back into focus, maybe with competent investigators. So as the years passed and the case sat cold, 3 distinct threads of suspicion developed in Fayette County, each pointing towards a different possible explanation for what happened to Denise. Each suspect raises different questions, and their backgrounds and their connections help to explain why the case remained unresolved, even after a confession became part of public record. That's right, a confession! My God. The ex-boyfriend, Sean McClung, was the obvious first-name investigators considered, and for good reason. Denise had broken up with him only weeks before she vanished, ending a 3-year relationship. She had written that letter expressing fears specifically connected to that breakup. During the original 1986 investigation, McClung was questioned, and he told police that Denise was still alive, an odd and specific claim to make about someone who had simply just disappeared. He also gave police an alibi involving a fishing trip for his whereabouts on the day Denise vanished. The alibi was later determined to be false. Not long after Denise disappeared, McClung abruptly left Indiana and moved to Arizona, putting significant distance between himself and a county where he was. At minimum, a person of interest in a missing person case involving his recent ex-girlfriend. That's a bit concerning, right? Right? When you go over there and try to retrieve that person. So for over 3 decades, that's where things sat. A false alibi, a hasty relocation, a letter expressing fear. Suspicious, certainly, but nowhere near enough to charge anyone with anything. The property owners is kind of another thread here. The second thread of suspicion involved 2 men named Benny Johnson and Randy Cates. Over the years, both reportedly made claims while drinking in local bars that they had killed Denise. However, those statements are difficult to assess because they were made while drinking and were never supported by confirmed evidence. Of course, it's very strange to admit to something like that just in general. There were also other details connected to the Johnson property that became part of this theory, including a report of unusual blood found inside a cabin days after Denise disappeared. Randy Cates was also alleged to have described a confrontation involving Denise, Benny, and drug use at the party. These details require closer examination, which we will return to later. The third thread is just straight up a serial killer. Now, obviously, this is the most speculative, but it's raised often enough in coverage of this case that it does deserve some mention. Larry Dwayne Hall was a convicted serial killer active in the Midwest through the 1980s into the 1990s, linked or suspected in multiple disappearances of young women across similar geographical regions and time frame. Because of this proximity to the area and the pattern documented in other cases, Larry Hall has been mentioned in connection with Denise's disappearance. However, there is no conviction, confession, or confirmed evidence linking Hall to Denise Pflum. The connection remains speculative and is based mainly on similarities in his known activities and his geographic proximity rather than direct evidence from Denise's case. For over 30 years, the case sat largely dormant. The evidence trail, damaged from the very beginning by McQuinley's lack of documentation and brain power, grew colder with every passing year. Witnesses aged, memories would fade, and people who might have known something in 1986 either forgot the details or carried them quietly, waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. That changed in 2018 when Detective Stacy Reese took over the case, and she actually had brain power. Reese brought a kind of personal dedication to the file that the case desperately needed, treating it not as an unsolved relic, but an active investigation still capable of yielding answers. Around this time period, Sheriff Joey Laughlin, who had been just 7 years old when Denise disappeared, took a direct personal interest in the case as an adult, later describing it as the great mystery of Fayette County for 34 years. It was during this renewed push in 2018 that investigators conducted a targeted search at Mary Gray Bird Sanctuary in Fayette County, an area connected to the ongoing investigation. Cadaver dogs, trained specifically to detect the scent of human remains, indicated the possibility of something present near the fourth pond at the sanctuary. The area was closed to the public during this search. Sheriff Laughlin himself stated that at the time, it was really too early to confirm whether anything was found, might be connected to Denise, but the discovery did not confirm that Denise's remains had been found. The search focused on a specific location based on a credible report that a dog indication was actually hit, but it did not produce a publicly confirmed identification connecting the remains to Denise's case. What it does tell us is that by 2018, investigators were not simply revisiting old paperwork, they were actively searching real physical locations based on developing leads, treating the case with urgency that it had never received in 1986 because of an absolute moron. By 2020, Sean McClung, the ex-boyfriend who had fled to Arizona decades earlier, had become terminally ill. It was at this exact moment, with McClung facing his own mortality, that Denise's mother, Judy, made a decision that would ultimately crack a 34-year-old case wide open. In June of 2020, Judy Pflum wrote McClung a letter, not a legal document and not a threat, a personal, direct appeal to his conscience, written by a mother who had spent over 3 decades not knowing what had happened to her daughter, addressed to a man she likely believed held the answer. Shortly after receiving the letter, McClung was arrested on unrelated financial charges. And while in custody, something would shift. McClung formally confessed on tape to killing Denise Pflum on March 28, 1986.
That I've done so hard to just bury. Now I've got to bring it back out. I'm starting to see her face again. I hadn't had to for a long time. Right. I mean, I was sitting there talking and I put my hands on her and pushed her to the ground. That was it.
And this was the moment the entire case had been building towards for 34 years, and it's worth slowing down, though, to walk through exactly what he said. In his taped confession, McClung explicitly admitted to physically putting his hands on Denise, describing a physical altercation that escalated to strangulation, occurring during an argument inside the car. It wasn't a vague admission, it was specific, physical, and detailed enough that investigators treated it as credible. On July 9th and 10th of 2020, the Fayette County Sheriff's Department publicly announced that McClung had been charged with voluntary manslaughter in Denise's death, specifically described as manslaughter committed in sudden heat without a deadly weapon. This distinction matters because it suggests investigators believed McClung's account of an argument that escalated in the moment rather than a premeditated killing planned in advance. And now, this brings the investigation back to an important detail from earlier in the case. Investigators offered McClung a path towards leniency, a form of immunity in exchange for leading them directly to Denise's remains. After 34 years, this was the moment. The confession existed, the charge existed. All that remained was for McClung to physically walk investigators to the spot where he claimed to have left the body. Well, he couldn't do it. His directions were erratic and inconsistent. He led investigators through what has been described as a failed search, unable to locate the specific location he claimed to remember. Because he did not fully cooperate or provide the confirmed location of her remains, prosecutors did not grant him full immunity that had been on the table. He then pleaded not guilty to the charge, even after his own taped confession had already become public record. The sequence raises some important questions. McClung gave a detailed account of the killing. He was unable to lead investigators to Denise's remains or identify the exact location where he claimed to have left her body. That's just you getting older and forgetting things. So after 34 years, it is, I guess, possible his memory of the location was no longer accurate. I mean, that would make the most amount of sense. It is also possible that the confession did not reflect what actually happened. Without additional evidence, the reason for this discrepancy remains unclear to this day. And in September of 2020, roughly 2 months after his confession had become public, McClung would die. He passed away on September 26, 2020 at IU Health Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis, succumbing to the illness he had been dealing with throughout this period. But the day before he died, McClung did something that would change the entire complexion of this case one final time. He recanted his confession entirely. He claimed he had lied about killing Denise, motivated by the hope of securing immunity for himself and financial assistance for his children. Does that make sense? Do you? Listening? No? Anyways, with his death, any possibility of a trial evaporated permanently. There would be no courtroom, no verdict, no formal legal determination of his guilt or his innocence. The only person ever charged in Denise Pflum's disappearance died with the case suspended in the most agonizing possible place. A confession on record, a recantation on record, and a body that has never been found. In the years following McClung's death, Denise's family continued fighting for answers, even without him alive to provide them. They pursued legal action seeking permission to search specific private property believed to be connected to where Denise's remains might be located. A Fayette County judge ultimately dismissed this request, citing statute of limitation issues as a legal defect in the filing, though the dismissal reportedly left the family room to amend and refile their case rather than closing the door permanently. The family also released statements through a Facebook page called Justice for Denise Pflum, thanking the community for decades of support and asking, understandably, for privacy to continue grieving a daughter who was taken from them as a teenager and never returned, even in death. As it stands today, Denise Pflum's remains have never been recovered. The case remains officially unsolved, and no one currently living has ever been convicted in connection with her death. So obviously there are several theories surrounding this thing. One being, with Sean McClung dead and no trial ever having taken place, this case exists in a strange and uncomfortable legal limbo, a space where a confession exists on paper, a recantation exists on paper, and neither one was ever tested in a courtroom in front of a jury. The absence of a legal resolution is exactly what allows multiple theories to remain not just possible, but genuinely competitive with one another, each one supported by real documented evidence, and each one complicated by real documented gaps. The first one, obviously, is McClung did it, and the recantation was self-preservation. One of the theories focuses on motive, particularly the circumstances surrounding the events at that time. Denise had ended a 3-year relationship with McClung only weeks before she disappeared, and in the time between that breakup and her disappearance, she wrote a letter documenting genuine fear connected specifically to him. This is not a detail investigators had to dig for or infer from circumstantial behavior. This is Denise's own words, written in her own hand, describing an emotional state that should have been a flashing warning sign from the very beginning of the original 1986 investigation, had anyone bothered to actually search her bedroom and find it in real time rather than like years later where they could have got the dude. But beyond the letter, McClung's behavior in the period after Denise's disappearance reads like a pattern that any experienced investigator would recognize instantly. You don't even have to be an experienced investigator. You just have to have a brain in your skull. He gave police a fishing alibi for his whereabouts that day. That alibi was later determined to be false, which is, well, you just lied to the cops. A false alibi is not a neutral detail. People who have nothing to hide generally do not need to fabricate detailed accounts about where they were on a day that later becomes central to homicide investigation. Now, that is not in the same vein as when you get pulled over by the cops and they're like, "Where are you headed?" And you're like, "That doesn't matter." That's a different thing. You don't have to tell people where you're going, but if somebody was murdered, it might be in your best interest if you actually have a real reason to distance yourself from it. Like, not the reason that you killed him, but like, "Oh, I was doing laundry. Here's some video footage of that." That is something you want to do, not lie about your whereabouts. So anyways, and shortly after Denise had vanished, McClung left the state entirely, relocating to Arizona, putting significant physical distance between himself and a small county where he would have known he would have remained a subject of suspicion and local gossip for the rest of his life. Then, of course, there is the confession itself, delivered on tape in 2020, 34 years after the fact. This is not a vague, generalized admission of guilt offered up by an exchange for leniency. McClung described a specific physical altercation, explicitly stating that he put his hands on Denise and that the confrontation escalated to strangulation during an argument that occurred inside the car. This level of specificity is significant because false confessions, when they do occur, tend to be vague and generic and kind of shaped by whatever details investigators have already been revealing to the subject themselves. That's why sodium pentothal is not used anymore, because it just basically gets people to confess to things they didn't do. But a confession containing specific physical mechanics of violence delivered without obvious prompting, that kind of carries a different evidentiary weight than maybe just a simple, "Yeah, I did it." So, God, the first investigator is an idiot. The complication, and it's a significant one though, is the failed search for Denise's remains. If McClung's confession was entirely and completely true in every detail, the obvious question becomes, why was he unable to lead investigators to the exact location where he claimed to have left the body, especially when his own freedom, in the form of a promised immunity deal, depended entirely on his ability to do so? There are really only two honest explanations for this failure, and you should probably consider both seriously rather than just picking whichever one feels the most satisfying. The first explanation is that 34 years is simply an enormous amount of time for a traumatized memory of a rural, wooded area to remain precisely intact, not to mention things that change in that area over time. Like the landscapes change, trees will grow and die, fences get moved, property lines get redrawn. A man attempting to recall the exact physical location of an event that occurred in a single chaotic moment decades earlier in the terrain that has likely shifted significantly since then may genuinely struggle to translate what he remembers into a precise present-day direction, even if every detail of his confession is completely accurate. The second explanation is considerably darker, and look, you can consider both if you'd like. But I think there's a third reason. But anyways, the second explanation is considerably darker, and it's the one that this case seems to be quietly pointing towards if you follow the timeline closely. If McClung's recantation was genuine, and he truly never killed Denise, then his failure to locate a body makes perfect sense, because there was never a body for him to locate in the first place. Under this reading, the recantation isn't a suspicious act of self-preservation. It's simply the truth, finally spoken, after a lie for reasons we can only partially understand was told. The timing of McClung's recantation also raises a few questions. McClung recanted only after prosecutors declined to grant him full immunity, and only the day before he died from a terminal illness had he even known about that, or he had known about it for some time. If he had genuinely never killed Denise, why would he confess in specific physical detail in the first place, particularly when that confession created legal jeopardy for him during what remained of his life? Confessing falsely to a violent crime is an enormous risk to take purely in the hope of securing financial assistance for one's children, especially when a false confession could just as easily result in prosecution proceeding forward regardless of later recantation. People do sometimes make irrational decisions when facing death, decisions driven by guilt, by desire for resolution or absolution, or by genuine confusion about what they remember versus what they have told themselves happened over 3 decades of living with an unbearable secret. it remains entirely plausible that McClung's original confession was true and that his recantation was the final lie of a man trying to protect a family legacy rather than a genuine correction of a fabricated story told for financial gain, which, again, we'll kind of get into a third thing here in a little bit, but not right now. The second theory is Benny Johnson and Randy Cates, maybe a drug-related cover-up. This theory focuses on a detail that has really nothing to do with McClung's confession or courtroom testimony, but may still be relevant to understanding what happened. The bonfire party Denise attended took place on land belonging to the Johnson family, which means whoever was involved in whatever happened on that property that weekend possessed something McClung, as an outsider to that specific parcel of land, did not necessarily have. Intimate, private knowledge of the terrain, the outbuildings, and the ways in which a body or evidence could be concealed or disposed of without drawing attention. The blood detail is the single piece of physical evidence in this entire theory that carries real weight, precisely because it did not come from rumor or secondhand bar talk passed around a small town for decades. It came from a specific named eyewitness, Benny Johnson's own girlfriend at that time, someone who had no obvious motive to fabricate what she saw and really no reason to just invent a story that would implicate her own partner in something as serious as a violent crime. She reported seeing an excessive, unusual amount of blood inside a cabin on the Johnson property days after Denise vanished, and when she questioned it, Benny offered an explanation that the blood came from a girl losing her virginity that she immediately herself viewed as implausible and strange. That is very strange. Consider how much blood that explanation would actually require to be believable. A single instance of that nature does not typically produce blood in a quantity significant enough to be described by an eyewitness as excessive or unusual. That detail alone suggests either an exaggerated cover story clumsily invented on the spot, or a genuine attempt to explain away evidence of something considerably more violent. And what a weird thing to say, just flat out to your girlfriend. So layered on top of this is the second account involving Randy Cates, who is alleged to have told someone that Denise had caught him and Benny using drugs during the party, became visibly uncomfortable with what she witnessed, and threatened to tell her father. According to this account, panic set in, and the two men killed her specifically to prevent her from following through on that threat. This narrative provides something that the McClung theory does not fully explain on its own, a motive rooted entirely in circumstance rather than premeditated personal animosity, a killing born out of sudden panic rather than escalating romantic conflict. The complication here is significant, though. A drunken bar confession carries inherently low evidentiary weight. People say outrageous, boastful, and sometimes deliberately stupid and provocative things when intoxicated, particularly in a small town where a missing girl's case has become woven into local folklore over the course of decades, and these guys were druggies. So, are their brains fully operational at this point? We don't know. So in an environment like that, it becomes entirely possible for exaggeration, rumor, and repeated retellings to gradually transform into something that sounds like a confession without ever having been one in the first place. Additionally, when investigators did search the cabin in question, they did not recover conclusive forensic evidence definitively linking that location to Denise specifically. This absence of forensic confirmation does not mean nothing happened there. It means that whatever did happen, if anything did, was never conclusively tied to Denise through physical evidence, leaving this theory suspended in the same frustrating space of plausible but unproven that defines nearly every thread of this entire case. So the third theory is just wrong place, wrong time, which is actually another theory from Detective Scott Jarvis, and this suggests that Denise may have come across a drug transaction or some other illegal activity while returning to the party site to retrieve her purse. Under this theory, she may become an unexpected witness to something that people involved did not want reported. Her death may not have been planned in advance, but instead resulted from a sudden decision to prevent her from telling anyone what she had seen. In this version of events, Denise's presence at the wrong place at that time could have turned an unrelated criminal activity into a confrontation that ended in violence. This theory also dovetails naturally with the Johnson and Cates account, since both center on the panic-driven violence following an unplanned confrontation rather than a premeditated act of jealousy or rage. If Denise did return to the property and did encounter something that she was never meant to see, the resulting panic described in the Cates account becomes considerably more plausible as a genuine motive rather than just simply drunken exaggeration. However, this specific account does kind of come from a single source, I guess you could say, the original case documentary that first outlined the details of this investigation, and has not been independently corroborated across other reporting on Denise's case. That doesn't make it false, it just simply means this particular theory should be weighted as one detective's professional assessment rather than an established cross-verified fact, and it should be evaluated with that context in mind. The fourth theory is a random predatory abduction, which this theory suggests that Denise's disappearance may just have been random, involving someone who had no personal connection to her. This idea is based partly on the documented activities of a convicted serial killer, Larry Dwayne Hall, who operated across parts of the Midwest during the 1980s and 1990s and has been linked or suspected in connection with other disappearances of young women from that period. Under this theory, Denise may have encountered a predator by chance while traveling along the isolated road, which, okay, I'm breaking in. I always do this. So, my girlfriend likes to hike, right? There was this guy, I cannot remember his name for the life of me, but he basically had like kill kits set up across the country, I think somewhere in Alaska, and she would go hiking alone in Alaska all the time. And apparently one of the kill kits was on the trails that she used around that time frame. So, that you just don't know with people, right? People are crazy. People have always been crazy. So I'm not saying, like, if you have a, what's what I'm looking for here? Moral objection is the best way to put it, to basically carrying. That is your right, at least in the United States. If you don't want to use that type of countermeasure, mace, tasers, anything. The reality is if you are a lone woman, or even if you're a man, and you're walking out in the wilderness and somebody approaches you, you need to have a way to deal with that, right? It is the best way for you to protect yourself. It is not a moral failing for you not to just inherently trust every human being out there, because there are literal crazy people. Like, serial killers are crazy people. There's something wrong with them, and they're not going to operate in the way that, in the pleasantries of social ability that you operate. So you need something to protect yourself from those people. And while they could have something themselves and they may get to you before you even have a chance to pull on them, essentially, the key is keep people outside of a certain range. If they're approaching you, or they're overly friendly, or they want to be like acting like your best friend, you should be on guard. You should go with your gut instinct on people, because not everybody is your friend. Like 80% of the people out there are good, pretty much. 15% would mean you harm but don't want to take you out. And then there's the 5% that do mean you harm and do want to take you out. So it's just stuff like that you always need to be able to handle the situation, male or female. And you should always understand that you are your first line of defense. A lot of people think cops are their first line of defense. No, cops are there to essentially zip up the body bag. You are your best defense in these situations, and you need to have some way, especially if you're going to be out alone, to deal with a problem. And I mean, that's where training comes in. That's where going to the shooting range. That's where understanding how you can quickly pull mace or use a taser properly, or just something to deal with the people out there that might mean you harm. Doesn't mean there's a moral failing on your part. Doesn't mean there's something wrong with you, or you're paranoid because you just don't trust people. You shouldn't. You shouldn't just inherently trust people. In fact, in human psychology, in our brains, how our biology, our neurobiology actually works is we don't inherently trust people. Like, whenever somebody tries to help, most people are like, no, I got it. It's because even though the pleasantry is like, oh, I don't want to like burden them, your actual foundational instinct is, I don't trust you to help me yet. That's normal. Like, we're in this modern day society type of situation. We live in a society where we think somehow we're above all this and there aren't actual monsters out there walking amongst us. But it's like, no, there are. There are absolutely people out there who are absolutely monsters, and popping a piece of lead in them to save your own life is the morally correct choice, because they are the one attacking you. So I know I just went on a tangent with that, but again, if you are against force multipliers, understandable. I'm not saying you have to go get one or something's wrong with you for not wanting one, but you need some way to protect yourself. And you can go with the non-lethal options. Those are totally available. Because if you mace a serial killer in the face, guess what's going to happen to them? They're going to drop, or they're going to run into a tree because their eyes are going to burn so bad that they can't see. Something to protect yourself is always better than nothing to protect yourself. So anyways, the theory we were just talking about carries real weight in the abstract, given Hall's documented history and undeniable fact that predators like him did operate in exactly this region during exactly this era. But when this theory is measured against the specific physical evidence of Denise's case, it becomes considerably harder to sustain. Her car was found locked and undamaged, parked near a location connected to a large populated social gathering that 100 people had attended that night before, rather than abandoned along some isolated stretch of highway consistent with a stranger encountering her purely by chance. A random predator intercepting an unfamiliar victim typically does not result in a scene this controlled, this quiet, and this connected to the victim's own recent, deeply personal social activity. There is no evidence connecting Hall specifically to Denise's case, beyond just a general pattern and geography, no confession, no confirmed sighting, and no forensic link of any kind. And this theory remains the most speculative of the four, resting almost entirely on circumstantial pattern matching rather than any direct evidentiary connection. So the question is, what could it be? Well, if we set aside pure speculation for a moment and apply rigorous logical reasoning strictly to the physical evidence actually documented across this investigation, one suspect remains more evidentially supported than any of the others, even accounting for every complication and counter-argument raised above. Sean McClung possessed the clearest and most personally rooted motive of anyone connected to this case. He had the most direct and recently severed personal relationship with Denise. He demonstrated a documented pattern of dishonesty with investigators through his false fishing alibi. He fled the state after her disappearance, behavior far more consistent with someone actively avoiding scrutiny than someone with nothing to hide who's just, I really like Arizona this time of year, and ultimately, he provided a specific, physically detailed confession describing an act of violence that escalated inside a vehicle during an argument, a confession containing exactly the kind of granular, unprompted detail that distinguishes credible admissions from fabricated ones offered purely in pursuit of a plea deal. Even his recantation, even examined critically rather than taken at face value, does not fully undermine the weight of his original statement. The timing of that recantation occurring only after immunity was denied and only in the final day of his life is consistent with a man attempting to protect his own children and his own legacy from a confirmed conviction rather than a genuine correction of a story he had invented from nothing. People facing imminent death do not always act rationally, and a final act of denial, delivered when there was nothing left to lose either way, tells us less about objective truth and more about a dying man's final attempt to control how he would be remembered. But logic also demands that we refuse to dismiss the Johnson cabin detail simply because it lacks forensic confirmation. A credible, named eyewitness account of unexplained excessive blood tied directly to the exact property where Denise was last confirmed to be socializing only hours before she disappeared remains one of the most single compelling pieces of unexplained physical evidence in this entire case. Independent of any confession, independent of any drunken bar talk, and independent of anything Sean McClung ever said on tape. This detail cannot simply be waved away as coincidence or dismissed purely because investigators failed to recover conclusive forensic evidence decades after the fact. Forensic confirmation requires investigators to know precisely where and how to search, and given how badly the original 1986 investigation was handled by a complete idiot, from the absence of written notes to the failure to even properly search Denise's own bedroom, it would be naive to assume that the cabin on a property really received that kind of rigorous, methodical forensic attention that a modern investigation would have demanded. Basically, you have a stooge in there doing absolutely the most crack work police job I've ever seen. God, what an idiot. So, is it possible, or it is really possible, that these two threads, McClung's confession and the Johnson cabin, may not actually be mutually exclusive? It is entirely possible that a violent altercation between Denise and McClung occurred near the party area exactly as his taped confession described, while an entirely separate and coincidental incident involving drugs, panic, and violence unrelated to Denise occurred at the Johnson cabin around the same general time frame, purely by circumstance. It is equally possible that in a small town where a single tragedy metastasized into 34 years of local folklore, one of these two accounts represents an authentic, if incomplete, memory of real events, while the other represents rumor and repeated retelling that gradually calcified into something resembling fact simply through the sheer weight of decades of repetition. Without a recovered body or conclusive forensic evidence linking a specific person or location to Denise's remains, no theory can really be established as fact. McClung's confession remains the most direct account of what may have happened, supported by details he provided and other circumstances surrounding his statement. However, the Johnson cabin evidence remains unexplained and provides another line of inquiry that cannot simply be dismissed. It is possible that these two threads are connected, but there is not enough evidence to establish how. In the end, the available evidence supports several possibilities without providing enough certainty to determine exactly what happened to Denise. This case shows how the failures of an early investigation can affect a missing person case for decades, especially when important evidence and records are never properly collected. Denise's bedroom was not searched, her phone records were not obtained, which again, that would just be the landlines, which are more difficult to obtain. And the original investigation was not fully documented, while the lead investigator was also related to her family. These missed opportunities became more difficult to address as witnesses' memories faded and the original physical evidence changed or disappeared over time. For Judy Pflum, the uncertainty lasted for 34 years. McClung's confession in 2020 briefly appeared to offer an explanation for what had happened to her daughter. His later recantation, however, left the confession uncertain, and Denise's remains were not found. At the same time, the case shows the importance of continued investigative work, particularly the renewed effort that began in 2018 and brought new attention to evidence and unanswered questions. Judy's letters to McClung also became an important part of the renewed effort, eventually leading to his confession and giving investigators new information to examine. After McClung's death, the family continued pursuing searches and legal options, while investigators also continued reviewing the case. The creation of a cold case task force provided another opportunity to examine Denise's disappearance and determine whether previously overlooked information could help. After more than 3 decades, the central question remains unanswered. What happened to Denise Pflum, and where are her remains? So at the end here, I always like to break in, even though I clearly have already broken in several times. The third option I was discussing earlier, something to remember about when the police start asking questions and people who have guilty conscience, there is sometimes a piece of the person that wants resolution to what they've felt. If McClung did take her out, and that is what's being alleged, then perhaps over the decades, probably at first he'd be paranoid, then he would be relieved that he got away with it, but then that would eat at him, if he has a conscience, over time, which when this all started getting brought back up, maybe he wanted the resolution of the situation, and because of that, he confessed. But here's the thing, right? People downplay what they do, and if they're downplaying it to the point that they're like, yeah, you know, we got in a heated we got in a heated argument, I was young and stupid, and I strangled her, and that's what happened. And then it's like, they're like, okay, well, we can offer you a deal if it did go down the way you say it went down, because it's a crime of passion sort of deal, and it's been so long. And then you get a lawyer, and the lawyer's like, yeah, your confession can lead to this, this, and this, and you need to recant your confession, because lawyers are there, whether it's right or wrong, they're there to use the law to get their client on the right side of the law. And by having an actual confession out there, they're now on the wrong side of the law. So really the only thing you do is recant. And it's very likely, at least in my mind, allegedly, I don't know if he has an estate or something that can sue me, but allegedly, it's every possibility out there that it didn't go down that way. He didn't just, in a crime of passion, strangle her. It could have been a lot worse than that. And he realized that, oh, okay, well, the immunity is based on if it went down this way. However, they're going to find this damage to a skeleton, which means there's no way that it went down this way, as I've said, which means now I'm on the hook again, and I'm not actually going to get immunity. So my best option is to actually say, whoops, just kidding, I'm recanting that. To me, that seems like a very real possibility. That's just speculation, and I'm some random YouTuber online, so don't be like, oh, this is probably it. But it seems like he was real gung-ho to, oh, I've got this immunity and blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden, I can't find the body. I don't remember where everything is. He could have remembered it. It could have been a possibility such as that. But I think if I were to look at everything, I have my opinions on who did it. The whole thing about the cabin, if it's a cabin, you're talking about deer blood. You're talking about people hunting. That to me, I don't know, that's a little more flimsy. But then again, the absolute genius who was investigating this didn't do a good job either. So, but to me, I think McClung has a lot more to do with it than kind of what he led on and recanted later. And I think it was probably because it was much more violent than he initially said. And after probably seeking out a lawyer, realized, ooh, I should probably recant that statement. But that's just what I think happened. Let me know what you think down in the comments. I hope you enjoyed learning about this. Obviously, when it comes to these type of cases, it's not really enjoyable, but it's more of like, it makes people aware of what's going on out there, I think is the best way to put it. So leave a like and a comment if you would like to. Otherwise, subscribe for cryptids and true crime, apparently, that I keep doing. But anyways, I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, Instagram links, Roanoke Gaming, and Roanoke Games links down in the comments. Not really the comments, but actually the description. And speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. At the literal Wendigo tier, we have Gradius, Monkey Man, Scrungle, Invictus Echo, Drake Von Lord. Thank you guys for your awesome support. At the Eyewitness to the Event tier, we have Dragon Master Knight, Hope Blighton, Need Extra Lives. At the first-hand accounts tier, we have Acidity, and at the second-hand accounts tier, we have Troy and Pouches. And to the rest of my patrons, I really do appreciate y'all's support as well. It goes a long way towards helping out, so thank you. But all right, that's going to do it for me. Hope everyone enjoyed learning about this, and I'll see y'all in the next one.